I appreciate your patience. I'm really excited to do this talk with you. I'm a licensed professional counselor, as it said on the information, and I work at Buffalo University. I have done a version of this training before with other churches and other groups, partly because when I lived in Oregon, which is where I lived before here, I worked at Multnomah University in their counseling center, and I did for 7 years, went to the Middle East and worked with people who were experiencing war-related trauma. And as our church would bring people over, we would see the impact of that trauma on our church members. And so it felt important to kind of address, what is trauma? How does it impact us? And how can we walk alongside one another? And I think it's a particularly salient moment to understand trauma, because when you do, it gives you the vision to kind of see what is happening around us right now. So one thing I will have you do is in the chat box right now, and I'll have Steph kind of pay attention to this for a second. I want you to just kind of scale from 1 to 5. This is something counselors like to do to people. 5 is, I've been to a ton of trauma trainings, and I'm kind of here just to see if you have anything new to kind of add to what I've already learned. I maybe even work with trauma related stuff in my work. 3 is, I have some familiarity. I've had some trainings maybe, but it's not something I deal with every day. I'm not super, super familiar. And 1 is, I know what trauma is, but I really never had a training around it. And I would just kind of love to know where people are. So in a minute or two, I'll stop. So put that in the comments, and then I'll ask Pastor Stephanie to kind of give me a sense of where y'all are at. So a couple things, like I said a minute ago, if you have something to write things down with or type things, there's a couple times where I'm going to have you stop and think about some things to write down. I will make these slides available, so please don't feel in a rush to kind of jot every single slide down, because that would be a lot. If you at any point, I understand as I'm doing this talk that there are people who are going to be all over the place as far as what they've been exposed to the last few weeks, what they've been exposed to over their lifetimes. So the beauty of doing this virtually is that you can if you need to take a minute, breathe, go get something to drink for whatever reason, please feel free to do that. And the other thing I'll tell you is, in case we have parents with kids running around, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to tell traumatizing stories or anything like that. So it's fine if they're running around. There shouldn't be anything that would be jarring or unhelpful for them to hear. So just to kind of put your mind at ease about that as well. So I think that kind of covers the beginning things. I would love to know, though, I want to hear from Pastor Steph kind of what we're getting in the comments as far as people's familiarity.
Yeah, so we've got, I'd say about half 1s, and then everyone else kind of goes up from 2.5 to 4.5 is our highest. And
okay,
it has been trained quite a bit. So I'd say that we're looking at a number of people who need some basics, and then others who are probably looking for, and I always encourage people how we would talk about it in a basic way to other people. So whenever we've already been educated in something, using it as like how this might be something I could help talk with other people about, especially if we have a lot of unconscious competence in the area.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's great. And that's super helpful. So thanks for kind of chiming in about that. I have 3 goals for this. Just for those of you who are at the 1 level, like I want you to have a basic understanding of trauma. I want everyone to kind of know, what are the symptoms of trauma, and what are the symptoms of trauma, vicarious trauma, which is we'll talk more about that. But what that means is sometimes those of us who are helping or in roles where we're around people who have recently experienced trauma and they're sharing their trauma stories, we also get impacted by that. And then just to develop tools to manage symptoms of trauma exposure. So those are kind of my goals. And if there's something else that you're looking for in all of this, feel free to throw that in the chat box too, and we'll see if we hit it somewhere along the line. So I'm going to start with this quote from Peter Levine, who is one of the big trauma researchers. And he says something that I've seen to be true so often, which is that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. And the reason I want to start with this quote is that throughout the history of understanding trauma and its impact on people, there has been this tendency that when people start to dig into it, they go, it can't be this bad. And so then they start to minimize or redact or step away from. So it starts all the way from the beginning of kind of the modern psychology movement with Freud, who, as he was working with women, started engaging with so much sexual trauma that at a certain point he was like, this can't be true. And so then he kind of stepped away and was like that. So there's something about trauma that makes us want to minimize and walk away from it. And I think that's really important to note because we're seeing the impact of that right now. And we'll talk more about that. So first, let's just start with a basic understanding of what we mean by trauma. And ultimately, we're talking about the persistent negative effects of experiencing extremely stressful events. So, and those effects can be in multiple areas, whether it's emotional, like some of the things I've listed there, but also physiological. They can impact how we view the world, so kind of our meaning making and how we think about the world. And so we're basically, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about the effects that these events have had on us. Typically, it encapsulates fear, helplessness, and a sense of danger. And trauma is made up of both objective and subjective experience. So, for instance, if all of us sitting in our different homes all of a sudden had a bear show up in our living room, which would be very surprising, we all would have the same experience. A bear showed up in our living room, but our subjective experience would be very different because of our cultural background, because of our personality mix, because of our past experiences with bears. I grew up in Alaska. My parents used to read me Alaska bear tales. They're terrifying. Don't read them to your children. But I would just say, so all of us would have a different experience. And so when you're looking at trauma, it's not so much the event, although the event is part of it, but it's also how the person perceived the event. So what happens when we encounter a threat? So if a bear showed up in the middle of your living room, your body would automatically do certain things because God created it that way. So your heart rate would go up, your blood pressure would go up, your breathing rate would get faster, and that's all to get energy so that you can respond. And then God made it so that parts of our bodies will shut down in that moment because we don't need them as much. We can divert that energy to survival. So our immune functioning gets shut down, our digestion slows down, we get this rush of adrenaline and this cocktail of chemicals that dumps into our system so that we can be on alert. And our concentration is focused on the immediate situation. A couple other things, so perceptions tend to alter in those periods of time. So people in danger can disregard feelings of hunger, fatigue, pain. Usually these situations invoke very strong feelings, often fear or anger. And this is really important. Most people, when they encounter some kind of major threat, are going to fall into one of three categories. They're either going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And it's based on the split-second sort of determination by our brain that says, here's the best way we can survive this situation. And what you will find is that people who go into fight or flight tend to have less shame around their response than the people who go into freeze. But freeze is an equally valid trauma response because sometimes if you fight or you try to run away, it's actually going to be worse for you. And on some subconscious level, we know that. And so we freeze in the moment because that is our best chance at survival. So for many people though, that, like I said, there's a lot of shame wrapped around that. And the way that we were created was that this threat response system was meant to activate, respond to the threat, and then settle back down. And then we go about life until the next threat comes along. But if you have enough things happen, or something gets in the way, then that system doesn't go through that cycle. And you can get stuck in different points in the cycle. And that starts to create some problems. So whether you stay stuck in the response, so your body's just on all the time, or whether you kind of get into this settle place where it's almost like it's not a calm settle, it's sort of a defeated settle where it's like, I don't even respond to threats anymore, which can kind of look like depression or things like that. That can also happen. And the things that tend to make up a trauma-producing event are that it was unexpected, the person was unprepared, there was nothing the person could do. And I want you to think about those three things when you think about the video that you may or may not have seen, and it's fine whether you did or didn't, but the video of George Floyd's death, and you can see these things happening, playing out. The people who are on the scene, they're trying to do what they can, but they're also hitting this point where there's nothing that they can do. And so you can see how that could really build some significant aspects of trauma in that moment. And for those of us watching, because we also now are witnessing there's nothing we can do, this thing is happening, we can't stop it, or it's already happened, but all of those things are kind of present in that video. So Judith Herman, who was kind of one of the first people that wrote about trauma and really researched it, she wrote this quote: "Traumatic events, by definition, thwart initiative and overwhelm individual competence. No matter how brave and resourceful the victim may have been, his or her actions were insufficient to ward off disaster." So in thinking about trauma and types of traumatic events, there are obviously single events. Sometimes we just have a single event of trauma, or it can be that multiple events happen over time. And then they kind of fall into one of three categories, and there's sort of a hierarchy in that way. So there's the sort of the impersonal traumatic events. So the car accident that no one meant to have happen, or, you know, you hit black ice and then you hit a pole. Nobody was intending harm. Harm just happened. There's interpersonal traumatic events. So it's someone you don't know that is hurting you, essentially. Robbery, assault, things like that. And then there's attachment, what we call attachment trauma. And that is what happens when someone that you are in a relationship with, and the nature of that relationship is to love and to protect you. When someone in that relationship is hurting you, then that's another layer of, it's another layer of breaking trust. And so things like child abuse and domestic violence. And I would say that there's sort of something in between that interpersonal and attachment, which is kind of a category where I would put like spiritual abuse, or even sort of police violence, where there are people in roles that are meant to be protective, but instead of protecting, they harm. And you can see how that can also be very damaging. So a couple of things I want you to just keep in mind as we are talking today. All trauma is rooted in the fall. This is not how God created things to be. Trauma was not present in the garden. And our responses to trauma are part of us sort of crying out with God and saying, this is not right. This is not how things are meant to be. Trauma impacts us both physiologically and psychologically. So as we talked about a minute ago, there's that chemical dump that happens. There's all this stuff happening in your body. There's also things happening in your mind as you're trying to make sense of events and make them make meaning. And like I said before, trauma symptoms are normal reactions to abnormal events. And when I say abnormal, I don't mean uncommon. This is something I kind of thought about more as I was doing this presentation today, is that sometimes these events are too common, but they're abnormal in that they shouldn't be happening. They're not the way things are supposed to be. So that's a lot of information right there. And normally I would kind of look around the room and see how everyone is doing with that information, but just keep note of any questions you have and throw them in the chat box, and we will make sure that we try to hit them at the end. So some common trauma symptoms to just kind of be aware of. Big one is avoidance. So we'll tend to avoid things that we associate with the trauma. And part of that is our brain is very efficient. And so it kind of goes, okay, the last time I was in this situation that was dangerous, so I'm going to pay attention to all the things that might let me know that I'm back in that situation again so I can be prepared. The problem is that the brain doesn't get very specific, and so it will go, okay, the person was wearing a blue shirt. I should probably be on alert for people in blue shirts. Or it was a sunny day, or I smelled the smell of hamburgers. You know, whatever it is, our brain will start kind of tracking with all those things and go, be on alert. Those things signal danger, even though they don't typically, they just did this time. And then we'll tend to avoid those things because they bring us back to that sense of anxiety. Other things that you'll notice, things like nightmares, flashbacks, which means I'm kind of in this moment feeling, it's like my body is back in that situation. So I'm feeling all the feelings, all the physiology is happening for me as if it was happening to me in this moment right now. Another big one is hyper-vigilance, and that is that sense where I feel on alert all the time. I'm scanning my surroundings for danger. And when you have enough traumatic things happen, you're going to be doing that a lot. And these are the people who in any given room know where the door is, or they're the ones who are like very aware when they're being touched, or I mean, it comes out in lots of different ways, but the thing about hypervigilance is it's exhausting. It's exhausting to be on that level of alert all the time because we weren't really meant for that. And so that's why you see a lot of exhaustion with people who have experienced trauma. Deliberate self-harm. And sometimes that comes out because I can't release the pain. I know that I'm in pain, but I can't seem to express it or release it. And the only way that I feel like I can do that is through self-harming. And then there's something else that I run into often, which is this reenactment piece. So we like good, complete stories. And when we go through a situation where the ending was bad, we tend to have this pattern of putting ourselves in similar situations in the hopes that we can redo the ending. I want to rewrite that ending. Sometimes we also do a reenactment as a way of punishing ourselves. Like, I am going to keep putting myself in this position because I didn't handle it well the first time. And handling it well might not even mean that you handled it poorly. It just might mean in your mind, a bad thing still happened, so I should have done better. So that's a big one to watch out for. And honestly, I see a lot of people pursuing helping fields that are actually playing out a little bit of that reenactment piece. So this is kind of, I use this as a sort of illustration of like, we're walking through life, and this is life kind of before the trauma symptoms hit in the world as we walk around. But once we've been impacted by trauma, it can start to look a little bit more like this. The sense of the world feels more dangerous and more scary, and our physiology stays on alert all the time. So, what are some of the ways that trauma can impact us? First of all, just that powerlessness. So that quote that I wrote from Judith Herman earlier, I often am looking for where's the powerlessness showing up in this trauma story, because it is just, it's always there. When was the moment where I felt like I wanted to do something and I couldn't? There's the loss of a sense of safety and security. So when you've gone through something really scary and overwhelming, where you felt like maybe your life was in danger, the life of someone you cared about was in danger, it is going to mess with your sense of safety and security in the world. And also, because so many traumas happen in relationship, it stands to reason that relationships are impacted and that trust becomes harder. The other big thing about trauma, and I think is the answer to one of the reasons we want to minimize it so bad, is because it calls into question our beliefs about the world, about the goodness of people, about the goodness of ourselves, about organizations that we want to be able to trust. And sometimes it's easier to minimize the trauma than to sort through those belief systems. The other thing about trauma is that it's often makes it difficult to translate those intense emotions and perceptions that you experience in that situation into language. And because it's hard to do that, it can leave the traumatized individual feeling very overwhelmed and isolated, because it's like, I don't even know how to tell you what I experienced. I don't even know how to quite to put it into words. And for some people, as I've worked with different people who have been impacted by trauma, the other part of that is that there's this fear too, that I'm going to tell you this and then you're going to feel bad. And I don't want you to feel bad. So I'm protecting you by not telling you. Let's talk for a minute about memory and trauma. Here's the tricky part. When we are experiencing a trauma, the very part of our brain that encodes memory is the same part that gets messed with in trauma because of the chemicals and the different parts of your brain that are lighting up and shutting down. So we don't remember well. And for many people, when they've gone through something, it's a little bit like this. It's kind of like let's say that you decided that you wanted to write the story of, what you experienced at church this morning, let's say, and you wrote it out, but you had to write it on different postcards, Post-it notes, a couple of words on each one. And you had Post-it notes of all different sizes. Some were really tiny. And then you stuck them all over your desk. You stuck some in desk drawers. You stuck some in a random file that had nothing to do with church this morning. So imagine then when someone asks you, okay, what happened at church today? You would have to go through and pull all of those different Post-it notes and put them together to make a coherent story. And that's a little bit what it's like when you've come through a traumatic event. So that's why often people need time to kind of sit and process and pull those pieces together, because it's not neatly encoded in their brain. And the other thing that happens with memory is that body responses get paired with aspects of the memory. So my body kind of remembers what happened in this moment. And now whenever I'm reminded of something that looks like that moment, my body responds as if that moment's happening again. So actually, before I go to the next thing, I just want to check and see, I'm going to ask Pastor Steph if there's any major, I guess what I want to know from you in the chat box is, are you following me? Is this going too fast, too slow? Like just a quick check-in on how you're feeling about what you're hearing so far.
Yeah, go ahead and type that in the box. I think that the Post-it note analogy was helpful, kind of like trying to take the idea of what you're experiencing inside yourself and figure out how to explain that. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of us, I think myself included, like you can see some of these symptoms kind of over these last even 2 months or so.
Yes. Yeah, and that's why I really felt like this was a good moment to have this conversation.
Yeah, good. The people are saying the pace is good, and they appreciate the examples and the pictures that you showed too, and the illustrations that you're giving are helping kind of wrap their mind around it. So people seem like they're doing
okay. Cool. Good. I just wanted, especially because we're going to jump into an even heavier part. So I was like, let's stop and just
good. Yeah. Some people are saying like some of it's stuff that they review for some things they've learned, but other people are the same people are also hearing some new things.
Okay, so, good.
And also I think for all of us, any of us who have read a little bit about this, it's a whole new world to think about it in the last 2 months or the last 2 weeks, like
yes,
hitting me differently than it would have 2 months ago.
We have so much context right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. Keep on.
Okay,
keep on.
Let's keep going then. So let's talk about racial trauma. So racial trauma is just the stressful impact or emotional pain of one's experience with racism and discrimination. And the good news about this past 10 days is that there's a ton of stuff coming out right now so I can get really current stuff on this. But yes, as you encounter systemic racism, as you encounter these different videos surfacing or hearing about these deaths, if you are a person of color, those are going to impact you. And some of the ways that have been identified, or some of the factors, let's start with that, is like we just said, so racial harassment, witnessing racial violence, experiencing institutional racism. And the other piece of it is, this might seem smaller, but over time, so experiencing that steady stream of microaggressions, those small things where it can be everything from, touching a person of color's hair when it's not your hair or your body, to making a comment like, where are you really from? Or just any of those small things. But if you keep getting hit with them over and over and over and over again, it starts to eat away a little bit at you. And that can, even if it doesn't lead to full-blown trauma, it can lead to just anxiety, depression, like some of those other things, or just kind of this low-level frustration, which would make sense. So I don't know how well you can see this, but when you get the slides, you can look at it. But for those of you who have experienced racial trauma, and I think I just realized I put this out of order. So let's look at this slide first, and then I'll go back a second. So some of the impacts that have been studied and documented, just again, anxiety, I mean, that just makes sense. There's also just this hyper-vigilance to threat, which again makes sense when you continue to see your family members, your community being treated in different ways. It's going to keep you on alert all the time. There's also been this documented sense of the lack of hopefulness for the future. Like, this isn't going to get better, and my options are limited. I can't have the same options as other people. And for some, there can be this general mistrust of white people. And again, that makes sense, especially when we talk about how the brain kind of connects different pieces together when we have been traumatized. So if every person that's harmed you walks around in a body like mine, the same melanin as mine, it would make sense that I might be a trigger for you. So just kind of understanding that those pieces, and I showed you kind of the article that I pulled some of this from. And this, I'm gonna go back to this slide. So Boston College has a great, some great stuff about racial trauma, and they have a toolkit on there. And I wanted to show you, there's this sort of racism recovery plan that talks through, like, what do you do when you're a person of color who's been triggered because of a racial incident, and what are sort of your steps of how to kind of work through that. In just, how do I stay connected with my community? How do I manage what I'm feeling? When are times that I can take a step back from that? So I share that with you, A, so you can see it, and B, so you can go to their website, which I have listed in the resources for more information on that. So let's talk about, if you are walking around in a white body, what happens when we are encountered with racial trauma? What is our kind of response to that? And we're pretty predictable in how we respond. I think for some, there's this defensiveness that kicks in of like, well, I'm not a part of that, or it's, I didn't do that, or that was from the past, that's not now. I mean, you can see it. All you have to do is go on Facebook and you can see it. So that's a big part of it. The second way that you will often see people walking around in bodies like mine is minimization. So again, we talk about, we do not like to look traumaful in the face. And so if we can sort of shrink it down, it's not that bad, or even use things to kind of cover over it. So, maybe, so like focusing on, for instance, the violence of the riots instead of the racial injustice that occurred. All those kind of ways to kind of minimize, or to talk about like, oh, well, George Floyd might have been a criminal. So there's sort of this vague, like, so maybe he sort of deserved it or wasn't as bad. All those things are ways that we minimize that experience for other people. Some folks will walk around and they will get taken out by shame. So the shame that, oh my goodness, I am part of this. I am, I'm the worst. My people are the worst. And the problem with shame is that shame just says I am bad, and it shuts us down and it closes us off. It doesn't allow us to engage. So repentance is good. Repentance says, okay, I have done something, or I've been a part of something that is not okay. I need to repent of that and walk in a different way, a different direction, like Adobe talked about this morning. shame is a shutdown, and it's not going to help. It's not going to make racial injustice better. So we got to, work through that shame, but then there has to be a point where you can walk out of that and go, nope, I can't stay stuck in shame, because shame doesn't move us forward. Another thing, and this is taken from the Intercultural Development Inventory, but is this idea of reversal. And you'll see this in different ways. When I worked in Lebanon, we'd see this often, especially with people if it had been their first time going, where they come back and they're like, oh my goodness, the Lebanese church is amazing. They're so much better than us. Like, the American church is the absolute worst. And granted, we have things we absolutely can and should learn from other parts of the world and other cultures and all those things. But reversal also doesn't actually help, because in order to engage in this work, we have to be able to own who we are while taking on this non-racist white identity, because it's only out of that we are in a stable place to do the work. If we get caught in this I hate my people stuff, we don't stand solid in order to be able to do the work. So the other thing, and it was interesting because I had a conversation with Don this morning that kind of highlighted this one for me, but longing for a way out of the tension. So for some of us, it's like, wow, these past 5 days have been really hard because of this stuff. And it has been hard, and we probably are tired, but the reality is that we have not had to contend. Some of us have not had to contend with this our whole lives. And so some of us, there can be this pull to this desire for comfort and normalcy. And I will admit, I've had those moments where I'm like, oh, I just, nope, embrace the discomfort, because this discomfort, something good can come out of it. But I think there can be this flight to comfort that can happen. And some of that is because we have not built up our muscles to live in the tension, because we haven't had to do it our whole lives. Our brothers and sisters of color have had to do it their whole lives, and they have much stronger muscles in many cases than we do. And that's something we've really got to work on. So that's another piece. So we can talk more about that. Obviously, there's so much more I could say about this, and I'm going to continue to weave these pieces in as we keep talking, but I just wanted to kind of sit with that for a minute with you all. So now let's talk about what happens if we don't work through our stuff. Certainly it can lead to mental health disorders. And we've also learned, and I way back when I first started researching this stuff, I ran across a study that basically was like, hey, if everybody in a certain group had one sort of traumatic event, some people in that group might show some different symptoms and some people might not. But when you get to, I don't know if it's like 5 or 6, everybody is going to show some kind of symptom. That doesn't mean that it's PTSD, but it does mean that you're going to be impacted at some point. And although PTSD is the most well-known, it's not really the most common impact. It's typically more things like anxiety, depression, a very specific phobia sometimes, or panic disorder, stuff like that. And not everyone develops a full-blown disorder, but they can still have some symptoms that they're carrying around with them that can color and shape how they're viewing the world. Okay, let's talk for a minute about kiddos, kids and trauma. Kids don't have the mental and emotional development to cope with trauma. I mean, it's hard enough for us as adults sometimes to wrap our heads around, so it's so much harder, obviously, when you're a little person. And even for, I'm thinking about like high school students and college students, it's not that they don't have the mental and emotional development, but I think what they don't have is the wisdom of having been through some stuff and knowing that what the other side looks like. So I think that comes into play as you get a little bit older. With kids, especially as they're younger, they may not have language to identify how they're feeling. And that makes it harder too, because something's going on internally for them, but they don't even have the words to name what they're feeling or why they're feeling it. The other thing about kids is that they're very concrete, especially I'm talking like pre-K to, elementary through elementary school. And they're egocentric, and that's just developmentally the reality. So they often believe they're responsible when bad things happen. And kids can make amazing leaps that you would never dream of about why this bad thing happened was connected to them. So it's something to kind of look for if you have kids that are seemingly impacted by something that's going on. Kids also act out when they feel powerless. And I'm sure any mom who's on here, or any dad could second that. Kids look to their primary attachment figures to determine how to respond. They're looking at mom and dad or grandma or whoever the primary caregiver is and kind of going, how are they responding? And then how do I base what I respond to on that? And there's the sense of, if mom and dad are okay, I'm okay. Now, here's what I mean by okay. Okay, it doesn't mean that mom and dad don't feel sad or have moments where they're crying or frustrated or overwhelmed. Not at all. Okay means that they are actually able to acknowledge and express those things, because it's actually great for kids to see some of that. But then for the overriding message to be like, this is hard, or this is a bad moment, but we're going to be okay. And I've got you. I'm going to take care of this. And if kids have that, they can handle a lot. And if mom and dad are not okay, or if they get a sense that like mom and dad are shaky, on a very subconscious level, kids tend to go, okay, what do I need to do to shore mom and dad up? Maybe I need to make sure that the other kids are behaving super well. So I'm going to start taking on this kind of bossy sibling role. Or they'll go, I don't want to stress mom and dad out, so I'm not going to express what I need or what's scaring me. I'll just kind of keep that to myself because I want them to be okay. Like they'll jump into all these different roles. And it takes a little bit of detective work to kind of notice what's going on and then ask some questions about what kids are doing and why they're doing it. So typical ways that kids show trauma, and the golden rule with kids is it's going to be their behavior. Their behavior is the thing that you're going to look at. If that dramatically changes over a period of time, that's worth investigating a little bit. But they also do, kids, especially when they're younger, will revert to earlier stages of development. You also have a lot of things like clinginess, nightmares, trouble concentrating. So this is why a lot of kids with ADHD might not actually have ADHD, because if they have a huge trauma past, it could be that their symptoms of trauma are actually what's making it hard for them to pay attention, not ADHD. So that's just a side note. But repetitive play. So kids make sense of the world through play. That's how they learn. That's how they make sense of things. Sometimes kids will get in this mode where their play should be creative and fun and have this sort of spontaneous aspect to it. If it starts to get rigid, or they keep kind of doing the same thing over and over again, that's usually a sign that they're working through something that's getting a little bit stuck for them. Other signs, obviously withdrawing, anxiety, kids also avoid. So it's a classic, like something bad happened at school, so now I don't want to go to school again. They also may show either no emotion or inappropriate emotion. And what I mean by inappropriate is not like kids' tolerance for staying in painful emotions is often lower. And so they'll jump, like they'll be sad, but then they'll want to go play, or, they'll kind of move from thing to thing. So that's not inappropriate emotion. Inappropriate emotion is kind of having the wrong emotional response that doesn't make sense in light of the situation. So those are just some things to kind of be aware of. So for kids, some of the things that are really helpful is, one, just structure, routines. Kids thrive on that. It helps make the world feel safe and contained. Offer some opportunities for kids to share. Don't force them to talk about things they don't want to, but things like, okay, we're gonna all sit down and I want you to draw a picture of something that's really scaring you right now, or something that feels really scary to you. And then have them tell you about it. So having some kind of cues about, or something that makes you really sad. Art is a great tool. When I am overseas, I everybody just knows I'm the person with the crayons and the Play-Doh because I just have them everywhere. You can use Play-Doh too. So like, you know, make something that that's making you feel really angry, and then you can have them squish it afterwards. And that's kind of a nice tactile way to kind of process through some stuff. Answer questions honestly. I think we chronically underestimate how much kids are picking up. So you want to investigate how much your kids know about what's going on, and then answer their questions honestly. Teach kids to identify their emotions. That helps them to get the language so they can tell you what's going on. So that looks like, you know, if your toddler is stomping up to you and upset about something, to say like, wow, I can tell by the fact that you're stomping and your face is making that face that you're really angry right now. And what you're doing is you're making a connection between what their body feels like and a word that describes that. So teaching them to do that is really helpful. And then helping kids learn some calming strategies. So I have a friend who I don't work primarily with kids, but I've learned when I go overseas that everyone wants to know about how to help kids. So I have picked up some things, and I've talked to people who work with them exclusively. So one of the things you can do is have your kiddo lay on the floor and take a stuffed animal. This one is actually too big. I would do a smaller one. This is Tigger. So I would do one that's smaller, and you want to have them lay on the ground, stick the stuffed animal on their stomach. And then they're going to practice breathing so that they're moving their stuffed animal up and down, which is basically just good old diaphragmatic breathing. And just have them do it for 1 or 2 minutes or 10 breaths. Do it, depending on their age, is how long you're going to do it. Don't do it for too long so it feels stressful. But a couple times so they can learn what it feels like to breathe deeply and to practice calming breaths. So that's a strategy. And then with kids, and this is true even as your kids get older, but limiting exposure to news and videos and things like that related to traumatic events. They're not ready for all that when they're younger. And when they're older, they might be ready for it, but it might be making them really stressed out. And so I even have college students who I've worked with who are feeling really anxious because the news is on all the time and they can't kind of get away from it. So take some news breaks. I know the news is really important right now, and I know social media is a really powerful way to stay connected and know what's going on, but just have some times where you can break away from that for the health and well-being of everybody. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about what happens to us when even if we're not the ones who are on the front lines of experiencing a trauma, but we are interacting with people who are. And there's a couple, people have used different terms for this, but the one I'm using is vicarious trauma. And this definition is great. It's limited in that it talks about people that are in a specific helping role, but it applies to anybody who is deeply connected with people who have walked through hard things. So it's this cumulative transformative effect on the helper of working with people who have experienced traumatic life events. And for those of you who are or who have been on the front lines of some of this stuff, you might find yourself connecting to this poem by Shel Silverstein, where it's like you come to this point where you put so much of yourself out there that there's not a lot left of you. So this quote I love: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water and not get wet. So this is why I wanted to do this training, is that I was seeing a lot of wet people because of everything that is going on, because of everything that you're hearing and seeing and experiencing, either through the people you love, through different work that you're doing to help rebuild this area, protesting, whatever it is that you're a part of. This really rings true. So this happens as a result of hearing the traumatic stories of others, and it impacts the listener because it challenges our beliefs about how we make sense of the world. And there's a sort of parallel process that happens. So as we're sitting and hearing this horrific story from someone else, we sit there and we go, oh my goodness, this is so terrible. And there's this part of us that wants to kind of fix it and we can't. And then we get that sort of parallel sense of powerlessness of like, this bad thing happened and I can't do anything about it, or I can't do enough about it. Okay, so I want you to take a minute. So remember earlier I said have some way of writing things down. I want you to think about a situation, an image, or even a smell that symbolizes something stressful you experienced in the last 10 days. And just let yourself kind of pull that up. And then I want you to notice what happens in your body. What do you feel in your body as you connect with that memory? And just notice it. And just be aware of where did you feel that? Where are you carrying that in your physical body? And then I want you to just take a couple of deep breaths. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you put one hand on your chest and one on your abdomen. And I realize you can't really see me, but here's my, and you want to just do some deep breathing. And those of you who have a music background have a leg up on this because you know how to diaphragmatically breathe, but that's essentially what we want to have happen. And what that means is that the hand on your abdomen is going to be the one that moves the most as you're breathing. So just take a couple of good deep breaths and practice making the hand on your abdomen move the most. And just let the air in, kind of calming your system down just a little bit. When you breathe this way, it presses, you kind of flatten out your diaphragm, and it presses on a nerve that runs all the way up into your brain called the vagus nerve. And that nerve helps to turn on your calm down system. If you didn't notice results right away, that's okay. Sometimes we have to build up our muscles for relaxation, but that's kind of how you do it, is you want to make sure that you're breathing from your abdomen so that you're pressing on that, pressing it flat so that it presses on that nerve and starts to calm your system down. So, what are some warning signs that you might be impacted currently by vicarious trauma or have been impacted in the past by something? If you are experiencing some feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, where it's like, I don't even know why I'm getting out of bed, or I don't even know why I would even try to do one more thing because I don't think it's going to make a difference. Feeling that you can never do enough. I should be doing more. I've heard so many people experiencing this feeling over the last 10 days. And the reality is we can only do what we can do. I mean, yes, engage in the work, but also recognize that we all have parameters about how much we can offer right now. And that can look different if you are working full-time versus if you are a student who's on break versus if you have littles at home. Like, that all looks different for each person. And this is the moment where you go, okay, God, what is it that you are asking me to do in this moment? Because I'm going to be about that, and I'm not going to worry about doing everything. Maybe some fear. Maybe of either the intense feelings that you're having, of just the sense of vulnerability of the things you're witnessing. And if we don't identify those things, they start to take up space. We've talked about this a lot, but that hyper-vigilance piece, and that can, for vicarious trauma, can look like I just get so focused on this thing that I let all the other parts of my life go. Diminished creativity. Because creativity takes energy and it takes bandwidth. And if we are feeling overwhelmed, those are going to not be accessible to us. Minimizing, and you might not be minimizing the current situation with racial injustice, but what you could be minimizing is when other people around you are like, oh, I'm having such a hard day because my allergies are really bad. Say that. And you're like, really? Your allergies? Do you know what real people are suffering right now? Like, so we can start to get a little less empathetic to other things. Definitely been guilty of that before. deliberately avoiding things. So anything that feels connected to what's going on, it's like, I'm going to actively avoid because I just don't want to deal with it. Disassociative moment. So this dissociation sounds scary, but the truth is we all do it. And basically it's just those times where, you know, when you've been driving and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, how did I get here? I don't remember like the last mile. Or somebody's been talking to you and you were just totally spaced out and not aware of what they were saying. So it happens, but it can happen more when we have been experiencing either trauma or vicarious trauma. Cynicism. Anger in and of itself is not a bad thing. We need anger. Anger motivates us to do action. So action, especially action towards making things better, is very valuable in this moment and as we move forward, frankly. But if it starts to bleed into cynicism and it starts to kind of show up in all your work, that's a problem. The inability to empathize or numbing, where it just, I'm so saturated with everything that's going on that I can't take anything else in. Like, I can see that you're sad in front of me, but I've got no more mental or emotional bandwidth to take it on. Addictions can start to get a little worse. So, and I don't mean necessarily formal addictions, but just even things that we turn to when we are stressed. So maybe we're drinking more than we were. Maybe we're online shopping more than we were. So kind of thinking about what are the things that I am attached to? Do I find myself craving sugar all the time right now? All of those things are ways that we can we're trying to kind of cope, but usually they don't end well for us. There's that chronic exhaustion, kind of bone tiredness that can happen. The inability to embrace complexity, and oh my goodness, if that isn't everywhere right now, I don't know what is. So there's this, when we are feeling overwhelmed, there is this longing to see clear signs of good and bad, right and wrong, and there's this urgent need to I'm going to camp on a side, and 120,000% camp on that side, and there's no kind of room to see the gray or the wiggle room at all. And that's a symptom of being overwhelmed. Grandiosity. So you can start to get the sense of my work is so important, or what I'm doing is so valuable. And when we're doing our work out of a need to have an identity or to feel like we're important or to matter, we can fall into this grandiosity thing. And it's easy to do, where it's kind of well, do you know what I'm doing all day? I'm doing the X, and you're asking me for these little piddly things. When we are rooted clearly in our identity in Christ and we are living out what he's asking us to do, that helps us to kind of stay away from this grandiosity piece. A couple other things to be aware of that you might be noticing in yourself is just forgetfulness or memory lapses, especially short-term memory just seems to not be super great. Difficulty concentrating, we've kind of talked about that one already. Just if you feel like I got all this nervous energy in my body and I don't know what to do with myself, and it's hard for me to kind of settle down. And for some, especially depending on where you're at culturally with ideas of trauma or things like that, a lot of this stuff can come out in somatic complaints. So headaches, stomach aches, muscle pain, joint pain, all that kind of stuff can be connected to trauma exposure. So I want you to take a minute and just think about, what are some of your indicators, either things you've seen in yourself over the past 10 days or over the past however long, or in previous situations when you have engaged with hard things. And I want you to just jot those down. It's really important to be able to know what those things are for ourselves so that we can have a plan for how to manage them.
Can you cycle back through them again, Lisa? Just
yes.
Slowly, for those of us who are still getting our brains around what you said, and that cute puppy on that one side.
Yeah, the puppy. Yeah, so feeling helpless or hopeless, sense that you can never do enough, fear, anxiety, that hyper-vigilance where I'm only focusing on this situation and nothing else in my life, that diminished creativity, minimizing. So other people's sort of petty problems feel really irritating to me. Avoiding, disassociating, kind of having those moments where you can't remember how you got there. Cynicism, that inability to empathize or to give anything else to anyone else because you're so saturated. Addictions, because the cute puppy, aka the cute puppy. Exhaustion, that inability to embrace complexity, grandiosity, and then some of the like forgetfulness, hard time concentrating, somatic stuff going on in your body. Those are the big ones. Okay, so what do we do with this stuff? And hopefully you had a minute to write a couple things down, because like I said, I think it's helpful to know. That's the best way to make a plan. So I love this quote, and it's by local Joe Saxton, but you can't heal what you don't acknowledge is hurting, which is sort of the first step in coping. Is you've got to acknowledge what you're feeling. And what that looks like is, first of all, to name it and go, okay, I am feeling angry, or I'm feeling whatever it is, boldly embrace it and acknowledge it. And the second piece is don't judge it. And I can't tell you, I feel like this is true for everybody, but man, when I get into Christian circles, it just gets even more convoluted. So what often happens is I feel angry, and then I feel guilty about feeling angry. And so now I am dealing with all this guilty feelings, and I don't even get to the anger because I'm feeling so bad about the fact that I'm feeling angry. Or I'm feeling anxious, but the Bible says do not fear. And so I am a bad person for fearing. So now I'm not a good Christian, and I wish I would just stop being anxious. This layer makes dealing with this way harder. So if we can peel that off and just get to the actual feeling, then we can work with it. But when you got this other layer on there, it's a mess. So we're not going to judge it. We're just going to acknowledge that it's there, and then allow ourselves to experience it. But I know that for some people, the fear is I'm going to get overwhelmed by it. And the way to kind of help with that is I'm going to allow myself to feel it, but I'm going to step back and be curious. So, and not to, quote anyone's book or anything, but step back and kind of say, wow, I am feeling really strongly in this moment. I'm feeling really sad. Wow, I wonder where that's coming from for me. And even to extend compassion, like there's a part of me that is really sad right now. And kind of think about, how would I approach someone else who's having that feeling? Would I be responding to them with all the negativity and judgment that I'm responding to myself in this moment? Or would I be able to speak to them in a different way? And kind of doing the same for yourself. Okay, the next one, and I'm going to go to the grave preaching this, and people will only sort of listen, but whatever. Get good sleep. There's part of the reason that sleep matters in trauma is that it gives your brain time to process and encode and work through everything that you've just experienced. So you need good sleep. It will make everything better. And for some people, that just means you actually have to go to bed. That's the issue. For some, it's like, I want to go to bed, but my body and brain will not shut down. So a couple ways to help with that is you need a bedtime routine. And especially right now, it needs to be a calming routine. Calming, like I drink tea, I turn off the news for 45 minutes before bed, I read something soothing, or I go for a walk in nature, whatever's going to kind of slow your brain down, calm your body down, so that you can kind of get to a place where you can fall asleep. And then the good hygiene piece. So that's just, making sure it's cool and it's comfortable and you don't have weird sounds that are keeping you awake, and, not taking giant naps in the middle of the day that then disrupt your sleep cycle at night. Like all that good stuff is sleep hygiene. So that all can help with the going to bed piece. And every once in a while, Google freezes because too many people are on it, which has just happened to me. But it will eventually come back.
We started sleeping we moved our bedroom into the basement. Best sleep ever.
Yeah.
I don't always know what's time it is when I wake up. Like it could be noon, but because it's so dark and cold, the best.
Yes, darkness is so helpful with that. So blackout curtains are good, you know, any of that. Okay, now this thing like went 1,000 miles ahead of where I wanted to be, but that's okay. No, that's a great comment. Journal. So I know not everyone's a journaler. If you're not a journaler, there are other ways to express yourself. So do art, do music, bake. If you need to beat the tar out of some dough, do it. Like that works too. And maybe just be thinking as you're doing it about what am I angry about and how can I like sort of process that as I'm making this bread. But the other thing with journaling, if you are a journaler, like make it work for you. Sometimes people get so caught up in kind of having these rules around it that then they can't enjoy it or it's not helpful. So if you're a bullet journaler and all that means is you just kind of journal by bullet points, great, do that. If you just want to sketch things in your journal that kind of relate to what you're processing, awesome. If you want to do traditional journaling, that's great. Don't feel like you have to do every event that happened that day. Like don't get caught up in things that are going to take the joy out of it. Make it work for you. Move your body. Walks. I mean, that's what we've all been doing to get by the last, I don't know how many weeks it's been, but it's a great exercise that most people can do. If you need to get energy out, strength training or boxing, things like that, where you can really be a little more aggressive. And some of us need to get energy out of our bodies. And sometimes if you're anxious and you have a lot of anxious energy in your body, sometimes you have to do like more calming exercises to help kind of take you out of that. So yoga or Pilates, something like that is great for that. Dance is awesome. And one of the things I've learned in studying trauma in different cultures is that every culture actually already has practices embedded within it that help with trauma, which I think is awesome. And many cultures, that's dance. So finding those things that allow you to move your body is very helpful. Your memory is probably not going to be great right now, and that's okay. So you're going to make lists and you're going to double check them. You're going to write stuff down and you're not going to trust your short-term memory for stuff right now. That's just how it works. Drink water. So this is a big one, actually. We talked about how the chemicals, all those chemicals that get dumped into your body to help you kind of jump into that alert place, those chemicals can only get out one of three ways. So you can only cry it out, sweat it out, or pee it out. So if you don't want to cry it out and you're not sweating it out, then you're going to need to drink a ton of water so that it can get flushed out of your system. So if you do nothing else, drink a lot of water. And we've kind of hit on this in a couple of different ways, but press pause from the news, from social media, even if it's just for 45 minutes so you can go for a walk and kind of turn it off. But we really need breaks. We can only take in so much. And it's hard because there can be this tension between I want to bear witness to what's happening, which is really important, and also realizing there's only so much you can take on. And I think especially for people of color in this moment, like it is okay for you to occasionally step back and press pause and reboot before engaging back in the witnessing, and also press pause before you post or respond on social media, because you want to take a minute and go, what is my purpose in writing this response? And is this going to be helpful or is it going to create problems? And sometimes we can see something crazy on Facebook or wherever and want to just kind of freak out about it, which I totally get because I've seen some of those things where I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And you just want to fire off these fiery things. Take a second, breathe, get back in your body, and then pray about it for a second and decide, okay, is this really, what do I want to say? How do I want to say it before I just jump out of pure reaction? A couple of other things. Power up. Don't do God's work without God's resources. I heard this at a Christian counseling thing I went to once, and I thought it was so good that I've kept on holding on to it. Whatever it is, ways that you're engaging in this moment, you are doing God's work, but don't do it without his resources, because otherwise you will wear yourself out, you will burn yourself out, and you will become frustrated and potentially resentful. So make sure that you're plugging into your resources. prayer, playing into, you know, if listening to worship music helps kind of center you, do that. Like, do whatever the things are that are going to connect you, and make sure that you're powered up appropriately. Try to maintain some level of normalcy. And I've been saying this since kind of the beginning of COVID. I know it's totally everything is thrown everything off, but building some kind of schedule for yourself that you can follow is super helpful. Identify the things you do and don't have control over. There are things you don't have control over. For instance, you cannot make the other person on Facebook see your point of view. You can't. Now, you do have control over responding in such a way that it creates an invitation. That's true. But if you take on responsibility for things that you can't actually have responsibility for, you are also going to burn out and get really frustrated with other people when they don't do what you want them to do. So identify what you do have control over and what you don't, and focus on the things that you do. Enjoy the little things. Sometimes it can feel like there's so much heaviness that it almost feels wrong to enjoy the dance party, the 5-minute dance party you're having with your kids, or to enjoy the cute puppy that you are seeing, or to enjoy the beauty outside, or whatever else are bringing you pleasure and joy right now. But it is okay to enjoy those things, and you actually need to. Like, it's going to help keep you centered and balanced. And then reach out to people who you trust, people who get it, people who, again, it's good that you're engaging people who don't get it. I think this is a moment for that, but you also need some times where you can recharge with people who do. So, and don't work in isolation. That is also a recipe for trouble. And then the big one, and this is something I really had to learn when I was doing work in Lebanon, because we would just get these floods of Syrian refugees coming in. You would just hear awful story after awful story. And it was so, it felt at times like I was fighting to keep my head above the water of the trauma stories. And I had to just zero in on, what is God doing? Where is God moving? Where is he redeeming? Like, keep your eyes open for those things. Scan for them. When we train ourselves to look for those things, we will find them. But if we get too lost in the mess and the muck that we can't see those things, it's going to burn us out. And all of this kind of boils down to self-care. So in a sense, what self-care is about is taking an active role in caring for our well-being in periods of stress. And self-care looks like activities that refresh you, but don't take away from your purpose. So sometimes we call things self-care, but they're not. I don't know if you've ever done that, but I know I have. So taking a break from your life purpose is fine. Being distracted from it, that's less fine. And then just some hacks for that, like schedule it in, have a self-care budget, even if it's only like $5. And once a month you go to a nearby coffee shop and get a coffee or whatever it is you like to drink. Create self-care goals that are SMART. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So for instance, if you set a goal of like, I would like to exercise more, that's great, but you don't have any way of measuring whether you're doing that. So if you say like, I want to go for a walk at least 3 times a week for 20 minutes, then that is something that you can achieve that is not overwhelming, like all those good things that make it a good goal. Accountability is really helpful with self-care because we will often tend to make it the last thing that we do. So have somebody in your life who will ask you like, hey, are you engaging in these things? What are your self-care strategies? What are you doing right now with that? And then revisit those goals and make adjustments, because as different situations come up, it's going to look different in every season. You know, when you're a mom with young kids, that's going to look different than when you're a college student or when you're a retired person and your kids are all away from home. Like it's just going to look different. So I want you to take a second and write down, what are some of the coping skills that have worked in the past for you? What are some things that are really good for you or really helpful for you in particular? And I want you to just write those down underneath the signs that you wrote earlier of when you are not doing as well. And then think about, is there any way in which you need to up your self-care game? Are there some goals that would be achievable in this current moment that you could kind of write down and say, okay, I'm gonna work on this over the next couple of weeks? Okay, you can keep writing. I'm just gonna kind of keep going for the sake of time. So what are some ways that you can support others? The first and the biggest one is when someone has experienced a lot of trauma, it is very important to be able to establish a sense of safety with them. And there's ways to do that. Part of that is just being a safe person means that you are someone who can engage in the skills of active listening. So you don't interrupt, you're not looking at your phone, you're letting them finish their thought, and then you're maybe even giving back to them. So it sounds like you're feeling X, and seeing if you've got it right. Because that validation is like air. It's like oxygen. People need it in order to kind of keep, in order to kind of manage what they're feeling. And so when you can provide that sense of validation through being able to acknowledge what the other person is feeling, that is a very powerful thing that you can do to help start to establish safety. Again, don't minimize. Like, minimizing is the quickest way to shut things down. In conjunction with that, be careful of over spiritualizing or jumping right to scripture. And I love to use the example of Romans 8, because often when we're going through something hard, someone will spit out Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God. But Paul doesn't do that in that passage. He doesn't start there. He starts at the beginning of Romans. And if you look back, he starts talking about how creation is under subjugation right now, and that it is groaning for the day when things are going to be made right, and that we are groaning, and that the Holy Spirit is groaning in words, in sounds that can't even be made into words on our behalf. Like, Paul validates the reality of the suffering before he ever jumps into all things work together. And that is a pretty useful pattern of, we have to acknowledge the reality of what is before people can even hear the next part. So I would just say, be careful about that over spiritualizing. Be careful of spiritual platitudes. They're kind of the worst. And I'm sure if we were all in a room and I had examples, you could all share some that have been unhelpful, but you know what I mean. Big one is being consistent. So with people who've experienced trauma, they've learned often that trust is harder, and the best way to kind of work on that is to be consistent. So if you say you're going to do something, do it. And I also think that also means having good boundaries up front about what you can and can't do. Because sometimes we hear a need and we're like, I'm going to do, we're going to make all these promises, and then we don't follow through on them. Better to make small promises and follow through 100% than to make a ton of big ones and then not do it. That is worse. So know in the beginning what you can realistically give. Be clear and upfront about that, and then be consistent about doing it. Again, you have to take care of yourself. It's kind of the analogy of the plane, right? You've got to have your own oxygen mask on before you can put it on others. So you have to take care of yourself. I loved this the pastor of Sanctuary highlighted this when he asked for people to come down and be a non-anxious presence downtown as things were going on. And I love that he called that out, because that is a very real thing. So if you can be calm in your body and centered in who you are and who God is, and walk into an anxious space, your mirror neurons, you have neurons that connect with other people's, and the people around you that are anxious will start to get calmed as they sort of resonate with what's happening in your body, and it helps regulate the people around you. When you are anxious, or when someone is anxious and they walk into a situation like that, then they're just projecting that anxiety, and it keeps both parties dysregulated. So you can actually help regulate some of the anxiousness around you by being that calm, non-anxious presence. And then ask appropriate questions. So by appropriate, I mean, go for more open-ended. Try to avoid why. Why just tends to sound judgmental. It just does, and it puts people on the defensive. And the other thing that can happen sometimes is when you're hearing hard stories, sometimes your curiosity can take over, and it's like, well, then what happened? Well, then what happened? Let your compassion lead the questions, not your curiosity. There are things that you might want to know that you don't need to know, and might not actually be helpful for the other person to be sitting and reliving every detail of. So keep that in mind as well. So I know I want to give us time for questions, but I also want to do an exercise really quick with you, if that's okay. So what I'm going to have you do is, if you're comfortable, I want you to close your eyes. And just start kind of taking some deep breaths. And then what I want you to do is, I want you to just focus on anything that you're feeling in your feet right now. Any sensations at all that you're experiencing, and you're just going to notice them. You're not going to do anything about them right now. And then I want you to move your awareness into your legs. Notice if there's any tension or tightness in your legs right now. And just notice it. Move to your stomach. Notice if you have any tension or tightness or knots in your stomach, nausea. And I just want you to notice it. Pay attention to your back and what you're feeling in your back today. If there's any knots or tight spots. Notice your arms and your hands. Notice if your hands are calm or fidgety. If there's any sore spots in your arms. And just notice it. Move into your shoulders. Notice if your shoulders are high and tight, or if they're down and loose. Move into your neck. Notice if you're feeling any tension or tightness, stiffness. And then finally, move into your head, your forehead, the back of your head, your face. Noticing anything you're feeling there. And then what I want you to do is, I want you to just imagine yourself breathing into any of the spaces that felt tight or tense, one at a time. Allowing them to open up and soften just a little bit. And then I want you to put your hand on your heart for me. And I want you to just take a moment. There's been so much going on. I've been saying a lot of things to you over the past hour and a half. I want you to just take a moment and go, what is it that I need to hear from God right now? Or what is it I just need to hear most right now? And see what it's like to try to take that into your body right now. And if there's any part of you that's fighting against that, that's okay. You're just going to notice it and be curious about it. And then when you're ready, taking as much time as you need, you can gently come back to this space. And just notice what that feels like for you, what you feel in your body now. Sometimes we need a minute to be able to step back and pay attention. And then when we're ready, I'm ready to answer any questions that you all have about, I know I shared a lot and there's so much more I could go into with any part of this. And I know we're getting close to the end, so if you need to go, that's totally fine. But if you want to stay a few minutes, we started a few minutes late because of technical stuff, so I'm willing to stay on for a few minutes and answer questions. So I will, if anybody has questions, I would.
People can type them in there in the Q&A. That was great, Lisa. Thank you so much. Like super
welcome.
Practical. That was super practical.
Good. That was my hope. So
totally. And we'll email out this PowerPoint to everybody too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't seem like there's any questions quite yet. Anybody just if you're formulating your question, just write, I have a question, and then formulate your question before we cut you off.
Yeah. That way we know.
You can head.
Yes.
And I have this recorded too, so I'll send you a link with this recording, and also the and people can share this information with other people. Lisa?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Cool.
Yeah.
I think we're good. That means you get a good.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just leave you with this Lamentations quote. I love this. You know, Jeremiah was in this position where he's looking at the destruction around him and wondering and coping with the trauma he was seeing. And he leaves in the midst of all, leaves off of his noticing to say, to remind himself, I have hope because of God's great love. And that is what I want to send you out with too. Because of God's great love, we are not consumed by everything that's happening around us. His compassions do not fail. They are new every morning.
That's good. That's good. Awesome. Amen.
Okay.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks for joining.
See ya.